Definium Therapeutics, represented by their CFO, Brandi Roberts. Brandi, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having us. Couldn't be more excited.
Well, certainly exciting times at Definium these days, with a lot of key data points coming up. And I was hoping we could maybe start with the next key data point that we're going to see, which is the major depressive disorder data for MMO for 120.
Yeah.
I'm so used to MM. So we're coming up on the phase 3 emerge data any week now. And one of the questions we get most frequently is understanding the translatability from GAD and depressive symptoms in GAD, which in phase 2, 120 did a really good job of alleviating, to true MDD or major depressive disorder, which is, I know a more can be more of a kind of a waxing and waning type of disease. So can you tell us a little bit more about how to think about the translatability between the endpoints, between these populations, and what your expectations are for what the placebo response might be in an MDD study?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we are really excited to have emerge anticipated to read out later this quarter. As you noted, we don't have a standalone phase 2 in MDD, so that's a question that we get quite a bit. And we had an investor and analyst day a few weeks ago, and one of the things that we really tried to focus on was the overlaps between GAD and MDD, and what gives us so much confidence there, because so many of the symptoms are very similar between MDD and GAD. And when you really look at the scales and you look at the MADRS scale and the HAM-A, there is so much overlap there. Like so many of the actual scales overlap directly from the MADRS to the HAM-A. So it gives us tremendous comfort for a standalone kind of MDD study. The other thing I would note is that in phase 2, yes, we did take a look at MDD symptoms on patients with GAD, and we saw a 6.4% or a 6.4 placebo-adjusted change there. But people, from a baseline perspective on the MADRS scale, we're coming in around the mid-20s. And in a standalone MDD study, we would expect to see that be more in the mid-30s. So we think in a phase 3, we're going to have more room to really show an impact, because we're going to have patients coming in that are in a true major depressive episode.
So would it be fair to expect that we might see a slightly higher placebo effect, but also a potentially slightly higher drug effect as well?
Well, I mean, in general, in our phase 2, we saw a very high placebo effect. We actually saw 40% higher placebo than what has typically been seen in these historical studies. And we've done a lot of things in the phase 3 to try to bring that down. And so, one of the key points of the phase 2 is that we saw a 25% dropout rate, and that was mostly on the placebo side, because we were asking patients to come into the study for 12 weeks with nothing else to really offer them. And so, especially for those patients who got placebo and they were washed out of their background meds, it was hard to ask them to stay in for 12 weeks. And those patients that were doing particularly worse needed to go back on background meds, and therefore dropped out of the study.
Right.
And so one of the things that we wanted to do was really try to address that dropout rate and try to bring that number down. And by having our open label extension portion of the study, that has really helped. And so now, patients, if they get placebo and if they still have moderate or worse symptoms, can be able to get drug 12 weeks after that first dosing session, which has really shown a decrease in our dropout rates. And we just put out our GAD dropout rates because we did our sample size reestimations, and we saw numbers 10% and less.
What can you tell us about the types of patients that are going into this MDD study in terms of the baseline characteristics, the degree of refractoriness, how rescue medications would be incorporated into the protocol?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of expanding on what I said before. I mean, these are patients that are in a major depressive episode. And again, we would expect to see baseline MADRS scores much more in that mid-30s range versus the mid-20s and what we saw in a phase 2. And again, that MADRS scale is so sensitive. It's a much more sensitive scale than the HAM-A, because so many things move together on that. So, for example, there's reported sadness and apparent sadness. It's hard to believe that those wouldn't move together. And so when you're really testing that in a true MDE situation, you do typically see higher scores there.
We've seen some data recently emerge from pivotal studies of other psychedelics and treatment-resistant depression. What's your latest view on the bar that you'd like to show to be clinically and commercially meaningful and successful on the MADRS delta, and how has that been maybe shaped by some of these other readouts that are emerging in the space?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a space that is still really ripe for new treatments. Patients are not really finding a lot of relief with what's out there today. As you noted, we have seen some results in TRD with placebo-adjusted changes that are, in the 3.5 to high 3 ranges from a placebo-adjusted perspective. I think when we look at what we expect, we've obviously powered these studies to show a 5-point difference. Um, and really, we put the bar out there. This is one of the things that we talked about at Investor and Analyst Day. Put the bar out there at 4, and we really think that if you saw a 4-point placebo-adjusted change, in addition to the durability that we expect, and so for MDD, our primary endpoint is 6 weeks, but we are looking at patients out to 12 weeks as well. You combine that with durability and the safety, really think a 4 plus would be dramatic. And also, we really care about the drug effect and being able to show a meaningful drug effect, because in general, that's what patients are going to really
Right.
see, once this gets further down the road.
And then maybe speaking of the overall landscape, how do you think that 120 differentiates most from some of the other psychedelics that are being developed to treat depression? What do you think of the big
Yeah.
standout qualities?
I mean, I think there's multiple. I think really in terms of the durability, our phase 2 showing 12-week durability for 48% of the population was really key. And this is on one dose, and so this is one dose in that 12-week period. A lot of the others need multiple doses in that
Yeah.
period. You kind of need a loading dose and then another dose. And so I think really thinking about this like a mental health day, and saying, you're going to spend 5 to 8 hours in the clinic, but you're going to potentially have relief for 3 months or even greater. And this open label portion of our studies is really going to give us the ability to see how long that treatment is lasting. So going out to, a year, we're going to be able to follow patients, and we're going to be able to see if they needed, 2, 3, 4 treatments during a year, but are really excited to get that open label information as well.
Let's shift gears to GAD. You
Sure.
showed rapid, durable effects, anxiolytic effects in the phase 2 in GAD. And you recently provided some updates on the trial and the powering based on what you were observing with regards to standard deviation and dropout rates, which you alluded to. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about, I guess, what some of those observations initially in those 2 studies and what the implications are?
Yeah. So, when we did our phase 2 study, as I said, it was really the first time that we were studying this. We wanted to do a true dose response study, really understand what was the appropriate go forward dose. And so studied 25, 50, 100, and 200 micrograms, and felt very comfortable that we saw a dose response for the 100 micrograms. And so felt very comfortable with that. Going into the phase 3, again, we had put some parameters out there of what we expected in terms of powering. So it was 90% powered to detect a 5-point difference. But we really wanted to put a bit of a belt and suspenders approach around this. And that's why we had that sample size re-estimation. So once we got half of the patients through the 12-week period, we said, let's take a look at those nuisance parameters. Let's take a look at the dropout rate and the standard deviation. And both of them were lower than what we had expected. So for both Voyage and Panorama, we have 99% greater confidence in that 5-point placebo-adjusted change now. And so feel really good about that. And also happy to announce today that we have completed enrollment in Panorama as well. So we had said that was coming soon, and have now finished that. And that final patient number was 245 for Panorama.
That's great.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's good to have all 3 enrolled.
Um, and then can you maybe remind us the different randomization approaches you're taking in Panorama versus the Ascend study, and just how that would affect patient expectations, potential for functional unblinding, what you might see from placebo?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, we feel like we have really addressed functional unblinding with doing that true response, that dose response study, because we absolutely saw that the 25 and 50 microgram cohorts were perceivable, but didn't have any clinical benefit. And the 100 and the 200 definitely did. So we felt that we have addressed that there. But one of the things that the FDA likes to see is really complementary designs when you're doing your clinical trials. And so one of the characteristics of Panorama was to include this 50 microgram dose. And it's really a confounding dose. We're not going to do anything with it. The analysis is still on 100 micrograms versus placebo. But what that lets us do is in the consent process, tell patients that, there is a 50 microgram dose as well as a 100 microgram dose. So just because you feel the effects of drug doesn't mean that you got the one that has clinical meaningfulness from the phase 2. So just another way to tell people to try to be really, really truthful when they're going through these scales. And so we feel like with that, we now have 3 different types of studies to go back to the FDA. And if we see positive results across those 3, we've really done everything we can from a functional unblinding perspective.
Got it. And if 50 ends up looking as good as 100, does that matter?
Maybe that's nice for a future analysis, but really just looking at 100 versus placebo for the analysis.
Got it. PTSD, obviously a big unmet need, and an area where psychedelics have shown some promise historically, but it hadn't really been on the top of your guys' focus list until very recently. What changed? Can you talk about this a little bit more, maybe the rationale for pursuing PTSD with 120 and maybe some of the learnings that you have from GAD that potentially de-risk?
Yeah,
efforts there?
absolutely. I mean, PTSD had always been on our list as another indication to take a look at. We are a relatively small company and have 3 phase 3s running and have Ascend kicked off now. So, 4 phase 3s in process. There are a lot of overlapping characteristics of PTSD from an anxiety and depression standpoint. And so it always made sense for us as something to take a look at. But I think when we saw the executive order come out and much more of an emphasis now on mental health, it made sense for us to really put that out there and say, we are interested in PTSD and we plan to kick that study off next year, and really look at that as rounding that out. That's another 13 million roughly patients in the US that are struggling with PTSD.
Makes sense. And then speaking of the executive order, I wanted to get into a little bit more about kind of regulatory next steps and policy. So, with the president's executive order on psychedelics recently, it appears that the attorney general would be able to start the review of scheduling or rescheduling following a phase 3 readout in relatively short order. So is this something that you and your team are actively preparing for? And how much do you foresee this narrowing timelines post potential approval for a launch?
Yeah, I mean, number one, we are excited to see much more emphasis on mental health. This is a ginormous problem in the United States. We have 50 million patients in the US with either anxiety and depression, and are really happy to see that. The scheduling component of this is something that we have been very focused on, and we have been working on that in the background for years now, of really putting things in place so that when we get to the scheduling process, we can go as efficiently as possible. So from a federal perspective, as it stands right now, the DEA has 90 days to get the drug scheduled. And then all of the states take a slightly different approach. And so we've really been working with the states to modernize their scheduling activities so that there are more that will accept the DEA's scheduling recommendation, and so that we can go faster.
What proportion have trigger laws now about? Is that
Well, so California and Massachusetts have automatic trigger. We've recently worked with 4 additional states to get those to be automatic trigger, and we're continuing to work on more so that they're available when we get closer to NDA filing. The ability to potentially reduce that 90 days is dramatic. And so if the DEA could work in parallel while the NDA is being reviewed and we could reduce that 90-day timeline, that would be a dramatic approach for us. And, obviously anything that we can do to get this drug to patients faster is really important.
That's great. And then speaking of getting the drug to patients more quickly, 120 has breakthrough status.
Yes.
Some of the other psychedelic drugs with breakthrough status received the Commissioner's National Priority voucher. Is this something that you guys have applied for or are considering applying for? And I guess, have you had any interactions with the FDA around this yet?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, we have breakthrough therapy designation for GAD, and so have had a really good relationship with the FDA. Feel very comfortable with those interactions to date. They have been very collaborative, and we have been very happy with responses that we get. They've been very timely in their response. We've had the same division director the entire time we've been working on this, and so are very happy with those. One of the interesting things for us is that if this MDD data is really compelling, we'd like to go to the agency and talk about filing both MDD and GAD at the same time. And so when you think about something like a CNPV, we have breakthrough therapy designation in GAD right now, but we don't have it in MDD. That is obviously something that we'd be interested in once we have our phase 3 data. And so would we need two CNPVs? How would that be? How would that kind of be in this new paradigm of kind of this new CNPV? And so, more to come there. I think for us, what's really important is continuing that dialogue with the FDA, getting to these data readouts, and then going and having a productive conversation with them.
Okay. And then maybe along those lines, just given the FDA's evolving commentary around single trial registrational programs, to the extent that, with some of the changes in FDA leadership, to the extent that's still going to hold, I guess, I mean, is there a possibility that positive emerge data could support an MDD filing just on its own, concurrent with GAD, or do you think you'll need two studies from both indications?
I mean, that's something that's been on the regulations for a long time. And so, the single study as a follow-on indication with significant overlap is something that the FDA has looked at before. And so we think that absolutely warrants a conversation with the FDA once we have the emerge data. And again, if it's compelling, really going and have that conversation. However, if we were to kind of go with the two GAD studies as our original plan, and then submit the two MDD studies following, that is something that we could absolutely do too. You probably wouldn't have too much of a lag between having both out there, because we do have Ascend, in full force right now.
Those trials are moving quickly regardless, but
they are. It's been great to really see the interest and people signing up for the clinical trials.
we get a lot of questions on the scalability of psychedelics. So can you talk about maybe some of the latest work you're doing from a commercial standpoint ahead of a launch, and just the size of a sales force that might be needed here, just given some of the nuances and distinctions of this space versus others? What other strategies are you going to be utilizing to generate awareness, demand ahead of a potential launch?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have been building out our commercial team over the last year and a half, and it's been really great to bring on so many people with great experience in the background. When we think about this, obviously we know that Spravato's out there, and it's been great for us to kind of see their trajectory. I think they're looking at $2 billion in sales and looking at 3 to 3.5 down the road. And so that's been a great place for us to look at as a starting point. There's about 7,000 centers that are signed up to do REMS for Spravato right now. And a majority of their sales are actually in a pretty concentrated, let's call it 500 to 700 sites who have really learned how to do Spravato day in, day out. But that leaves a really big chunk who only do Spravato on a semi-regular basis. And what we would like to do is really do the same thing that we've done in clinical development. We've really taken the time to build relationships with our sites, and we think that that's how you do it from a commercial standpoint as well. So it's not just about sales reps, but it's also about providing support for REMS and payer support, and making sure that their experience is as easy as possible, because once they have one patient do well, then they're going to want to do another patient. So we think about that in terms of having a couple hundred people on the ground, but it's not just doing sales support, it's doing kind of that whole gamut of making the experience great.
What about from the payer reimbursement side? Some of the payer feedback we've gotten has been somewhat positive, but I guess I'm curious what specifically you've heard in your recent conversations with payers, how that guides your framework for how you might price 120, perhaps relative to the different price points or the price range of Spravato. And I'm curious, what value proposition arguments do you think resonate most? Is it rapid onset, the durability, the reduced potential for hospitalizations? I guess, how are you framing this to payers, and what is their initial kind of pre-data feedback?
Sure. So, the Spravato pricing, it has a wide range right now. So it's roughly $30,000 to $70,000 a year, depending on low dose or high dose and the frequency of taking it. But, in general, Spravato is taken 56 times a year. It's twice a week for the first month, and then once a week thereafter. And so from our perspective, we have used that Spravato analog in talking to payers, and they are absolutely open to understanding that as an analog. Obviously, our data will inform that in terms of where in that range makes the most amount of sense. But if we see the efficacy that we're hoping to see, along with the durability, I think that that really is a game changer and can help us be on kind of that higher end of the range. Now, obviously, what we want to see too is what our retreatment patterns look like. So right now we talk about pricing from an annual perspective because that's really what payers care about. But once we get this retreatment information, which we will have some of that data at top line as well, will really inform us as to what that will look like on a treatment basis. But when we think about what this really means to payers, when you think about a treatment that you have to take that often and you're going in, once a week right now on Spravato, unfortunately, a lot of people drop out after 6 months. And so from a payer perspective, they've kind of paid all of that money through the first 6 months, and now a patient's kind of back in the same spot, and they're going to have to restart some type of new treatment. And so from our perspective, if we are able to show that treatment durability, that could make a big difference from a payer perspective if you're keeping people feeling better for a longer period of time.
Maybe just speaking of retreatment and durability, what's your base case for how frequently this would need to be administered in an average patient? And are you, as you've seen sort of open label experience kind of pan out between phase 2, phase 3, is there, looking at other programs, is there anything that you're sort of centering around as, maybe 2 treatments a year, 3, 1.5? What's your
You know,
best guess?
I think the hardest thing is there's probably not going to necessarily be an average patient.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to have a little bit different of a case, and so you could see it where a patient is one and done. You
Yeah.
could see where a patient is comes in once and then in 3 months needs another treatment and then is good for a considerable period after that. In our phase 2, we had 12-week data. We didn't show it really reducing to baseline.
Right.
That line kind of stayed consistent. And so we'd really love to see something, in that 2 to 4 realm, treatments per year. But again, we couldn't be more excited to see what we see in all of these phase 3s.
One last question. We often get asked about the intellectual property protection. Obviously, LSD has been around a long time. You have a unique formulation, but can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the overall IP strategy that you're using for 120, in terms of the protection offered by the formulation, as well as how other aspects like the REMS, the state drug scheduling might impact or might keep a generic off the market?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so really the strategy was to have a multi-layered approach. And so, as you stated, we do have patents on salts and on polymorphs. We also have patents related to the ODT formulation of our drug. So that oral dissolving, the tablet does have IP strategy around that as well. Obviously, GAD and MDD methods of treatment, as well as you said, the REMS program and really what that will put around kind of barriers of protection around DT120 to really protect that from generics as well. And you have to remember too that this is something where providers are going to look at a buy and bill situation, and so thinking about that spread that they get in terms of drug, having a higher price drug is something that is really typically important in that buy and bill approach. And obviously the customer service that we're going to bring to and that white glove approach that we want to have is something that would typically not be apparent with a generic if it was coming to the market. So we feel like we've got
Operational considerations for sure.
absolutely a lot of layers there from an IP perspective.
Good. Well, we're unfortunately out of time, but Brandi, thank you so much. This was really insightful, and best of luck in the coming months. And
Thank you so much. We couldn't be more excited.
Thanks for being
Great.
here.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.